Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time. Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into political influence, and we're drawing exclusively from Jane Mayer's really rigorous investigative book, Dark Money, The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right.
And our goal here is to do a real systems analysis. We're going to try to look past the day-to-day electoral politics that you see in the headlines. Instead, we're going to examine the mechanisms, the structural incentives, and really the entire architecture that allows immense private wealth to exert power. All of this happening, outside the traditional public view.
So this is about the engineering of political outcomes.
Exactly. And it's all based entirely on Mayer's reporting. We're not focused on who to root for, but on how the machine itself actually works.
Okay, so leave and pack this. I think we have to start by grounding ourselves in the author and just the sheer scope of this investigation.
We do.
Jane Mayer is a staff writer for The New Yorker. She's an investigative journalist, and her previous work, like The Dark Side on the War on Terror, that already established her as a major voice in accountability journalism.
Right. She's known for just meticulous, decades-spanning research, and that scope is absolutely essential here.
Why is that? Why the long view?
Because dark money isn't about some sudden political shift. It's about a patient, sustained, really long-term project. Mayer tracks the trajectory of a very specific, you could say, radical strain of conservative libertarian politics.
And it's important for us to remember just how fringe these ideas once were.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
She makes a point of this. Back in 1980, when David Koch actually ran for vice president on the Libertarian Party ticket,
Right.
the entire movement received only about 1% of the American popular vote.
Yeah.
1%.
So we're really tracking a movement that went from the absolute political margins to becoming a dominant foundational force in one of America's major political parties. How does Mayer document that incredible transformation?
She does it by, the oldest rule in investigative journalism. She follows the money trail. She details the sustained financial efforts of a handful of wealthy, very intensely ideological families.
And the main actors are, of course, Charles and David Koch.
They're central to the story, yes. Mayer explores the origins of their immense fortune, and she notes that it was derived in part from their family patriarch, Fred Koch. And he had some, let's say, controversial business dealings.
That's putting it mildly.
Right. He was building oil refineries for Stalin's Soviet Union and also for Hitler's Third Reich back in the 1930s.
And that historical context seems really relevant. It feels like it frames the intense anti-government libertarian principles that drove the whole project later on.
It does. Mayer argues that the experience of the patriarch, Fred Koch, with these totalitarian regimes really solidified a fierce anti-state, anti-regulation ideology that he then passed down to his sons. So the goals that were articulated by the network his sons built were very specific and sweeping.
What were they?
They wanted to achieve what they called limited government, drastic tax reductions, gutting social services, and crucially, minimizing governmental oversight, especially environmental regulation.
And Mayer makes a critical connection there, doesn't she, between those ideological goals and the family's own material interests.
She does. And this is key. It's not just some abstract political philosophy. It aligns perfectly, seamlessly with their business model. Charles and David Koch built Koch Industries into this massive, privately held conglomerate.
And it's rooted heavily in what?
Extractive industries, oil, gas, chemicals, refining. So reducing or eliminating environmental regulation, cutting corporate taxes, limiting federal oversight.
All of that directly translates into higher profits for their company.
Exactly. Mayer establishes this idea of regulatory self-preservation as the foundational incentive for the entire project.
So what was the catalyst? What was the moment that really accelerated this long-term project and turned it into, a political war machine?
Mayer points to the election of Barack Obama in 2008. That was perceived as an existential crisis by Charles Koch. He feared a massive liberal resurgence, an increase in federal spending, what he saw as draconian regulation. In fact, in January 2009, Charles Koch described that political moment in almost apocalyptic terms. He said he feared the greatest loss of liberty and prosperity since the 1930s.
So that deep-seated fear provided the urgency.
It provided the urgency and, in their minds, the justification for mobilizing their vast financial resources into what became this political war machine.
Okay, so if they failed at the ballot box in 1980 with that 1% showing, they had to completely change the rules of the game. What was the architectural strategy that Mayer found they implemented to exert their, minority views on the majority?
The key realization, and Mayer details this through interviews and leaked materials, was that they couldn't win conventionally. Politician by politician. It wasn't working.
So they needed a new approach.
A systemic one. They needed to systematically change how America votes, how policy is made, and how institutions function. So starting formally in the mid-1970s, but really accelerating after 2008, they set about building this comprehensive national political machine.
The coctopus.
Exactly. It earned that nickname because it was so complex, with tentacles reaching into policy, law, media, academia, everywhere.
And the lifeblood of that machine, the thing that makes it all possible, is the mechanism that hides where the funding is coming from, what we now just call dark money. How exactly did they achieve that level of concealment?
The mechanism is the strategic exploitation of the U.S. tax code. It's really that simple at its core. They rely heavily on specific nonprofit structures, primarily 501c for social welfare groups and 501c business leagues.
Okay, break that down for us. What's a 501c4?
A 501c4 is classified as tax-exempt because it supposedly promotes social welfare. But the critical point is that, unlike a 501c charity, which is what most people think of, Red Cross or a food bank, which are largely prohibited from political activity, a 501c4 can engage in substantial political spending. The rule is just that it can't be its primary purpose.
It's a pretty vague line.
A very vague line. And the essential difference, the thing a donor gets from a 501c4 that they don't get from, say, a public political action committee or a PAC.
Secrecy.
Secrecy. Anonymity. A donor can give unlimited amounts of money to a 501c4 for political purposes, and that organization is not required to publicly disclose its donors. This is the source of the term dark money.
And groups like Freedom Partners, Chamber of Commerce, that was one of the big ones.
A massive one. It's a 501c6 that coordinates spending across the entire network. They became these pipelines allowing huge political spending while completely concealing the identities of the wealthy individuals who were underwriting the whole operation.
And Mayer's analysis actually quantified this. She put a number on the sheer scale of this concealed spending.
The numbers are just extraordinary. Her research showed the Koch network alone spent over $760 million through these mysterious, supposedly apolitical nonprofits. And that was just between 2010 and 2014.
$760 million?
And if you look specifically at the 2010 midterm elections, which was really the first major cycle after the Citizens United Supreme Court decision.
Right, which opened the floodgates.
It did. Outside spending from groups hiding their donors suddenly jumped to 40% of the total. That one mechanism masked hundreds of millions of dollars. It meant a huge portion of the political messaging you were seeing on TV was essentially anonymous.
You mentioned an organization called Donors Trust. It seems like that was a financial layer designed specifically to add even more opacity to the system.
It was. Donors Trust was described in the book as an explicit financial shield. It functions as what's called a donor-advised fund.
How does that work?
Wealthy families can deposit their money into the fund, they take an immediate tax deduction, and then the trust disperses the money to various policy groups. It further separates the original donor from the final recipient.
So it's another layer of insulation.
It's another layer. Mayer reported that this intermediary was explicitly designed to mask the money trail from these deeply ideological family fortunes, like the Kochs, the Bradleys, the Scaife, especially when the money was going toward politically contentious efforts, like, for instance, funding climate change denial organizations.
So the goal was plausible deniability.
Layers of separation. Plausible deniability, making public tracking of the money nearly impossible.
Okay, let's pivot to the way that something as seemingly benign as charitable giving was, as Mayer puts it, weaponized. She detailed how philanthropy became an ideological delivery system. What makes donating to a foundation a calculated political strategy instead of just, charity?
It's the dual incentive system that's embedded right in the tax code. When a wealthy individual donates millions to, say, a foundation or a university program, they receive a generous tax deduction. This means they get to divert funds, which would otherwise be paid in taxes to the government, into institutions that they select.
So they get to control where the money impacts society.
They get to control it completely. They're essentially funding their preferred vision of public policy through think tanks or academia, and they're doing it on the taxpayer's dime because of the deduction.
So it's about control over impact, but it's also about control over money that would otherwise be public government revenue.
That's it exactly. Mayer quotes an insider who just lays this bare. This person lays out the strategic rationale, suggesting philanthropy was preferable to paying taxes. The quote is, "It's just the best available option for them. If they didn't give it to their causes, they would have to give it to the government. At least this way they control how it's spent."
That's a stunningly frank admission.
It is. And it transforms charity from, a moral obligation into a calculated tax-advantaged political investment, one that's designed to undercut the public sector it's supposed to be supporting.
Mayer also shows this strategy has historical roots, right? This isn't some modern invention of the last decade.
Not at all. No.
Yeah.
She traces it back to figures like Richard Mellon Scaife. In 1973, Scaife made a decision that fundamentally changed the entire landscape. He reoriented his family's massive foundation entirely toward funding public affairs.
And what did that mean in practice?
It meant this strategic shift enabled him to bankroll over 133 conservative institutions and think tanks. He was essentially fulfilling the blueprint that had been laid out just 2 years earlier in the infamous 1971 Powell Memo.
For listeners who might not be familiar, can you just briefly explain the significance of the Powell Memo in setting this foundation?
Sure. The memo was written by Lewis Powell, who was a corporate lawyer at the time, right before he went to the Supreme Court. He argued that the American free enterprise system was under a systemic attack from liberal intellectuals, from activists, from universities, and he called for corporate America to fund a counterintelligentsia, a sophisticated, multi-pronged infrastructure, think tanks, academic programs, legal institutions to fight liberal ideas and promote free market ideology.
So Scaife's foundation funding became the initial financial engine that turned that memo's vision into a working reality.
That's right. He put the money behind the theory.
Which brings us directly to the third architectural pillar you mentioned,
Yeah.
the strategic investment in courts and academia, what Mayer calls the ideas war.
Yeah.
Why spend so much time and money on these intellectual foundations when you could just, fund a bunch of attack ads during an election?
Because the network concluded that short-term political campaigning was just insufficient. It was like treating a symptom, not the disease. Mayer quotes a confidant of the Koch saying that elected politicians were merely actors playing out a script.
That's a powerful metaphor.
It is. And their conclusion was that to achieve lasting change, they had to supply the themes and words for the scripts. They had to influence the very intellectual sources of policy, academia, and think tanks. It was a long-game strategy of institutional capture.
So how did this strategy specifically target the judiciary?
It used the exact same logic that was articulated in the Powell Memo. Powell had claimed the judiciary may be the most important instrument for social, economic, and political change. So another key actor, the Olin Foundation, undertook this huge, targeted effort to underwrite what's known as the law and economics movement.
And they poured a lot of money into this.
A ton. They spent $68 million injecting these ideas into elite law schools. We're talking Harvard, Yale, Chicago.
And what was the practical effect of making law and economics so central to legal education at these elite schools?
It transformed what had been a pretty fringe theory. The idea that legal decisions should primarily prioritize economic efficiency and wealth creation, often over concerns for, say, equality or social justice. It took that idea and made it into a kind of legal hegemony.
So you're saying this intellectual groundwork, training generations of conservative and libertarian judges and lawyers.
It was the essential precondition. Mayer argues it ultimately set the stage for rulings on things like campaign finance, culminating in the 2010 Citizens United decision, which validated unlimited political spending as a form of free speech. They weren't just trying to influence judges, they were creating the entire intellectual environment for those judges to rule in favor of the network's goals.
And that long-term strategy extended directly into policy institutes that were kind of disguised as academic centers. The example of George Mason University's Mercatus Center seems particularly illustrative of this whole mechanism.
It is. The Mercatus Center became the single largest recipient of Koch funds for higher education. And critics, who were cited by Mayer, described it as a lobbying group disguised as a disinterested academic program.
Why that description?
Because of its proximity to Washington, D.C., and its very direct policy advocacy work that often served corporate interests. The line between scholarly research and direct corporate lobbying was, intentionally blurred.
And the specific case of Wendy Graham and what's known as the Enron loophole really shows that blurring in sharp focus.
Absolutely. It's a perfect case study. Wendy Graham was an economist who headed Mercatus's regulatory studies program in the mid-1990s. And this was shortly after she had served as the head of the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the main regulator.
So she went from regulator to running a university program funded by the regulated.
Exactly. And while she was at Mercatus, she strongly pushed Congress to support a legislative measure, the Enron loophole, that exempted certain energy derivatives from federal regulatory oversight. And this product was immensely profitable for both Enron and for Koch Industries.
And after the legislative success,
Graham left Mercatus and received up to $1.8 million in compensation and stock options from Enron, even as Enron's chairman was donating to the Mercatus Center. By 2015, the Charles Koch Foundation was subsidizing hundreds of academic programs nationwide, over 307 institutions, all of them focused on promoting pro-business, anti-regulatory, anti-tax ideas. This showed the sheer breadth and depth of the influence campaign.
so the script was being written long before any politician ever spoke a word.
That's the key takeaway.
So if we synthesize all of this, Mayer's book is giving us a critical systems map. It shows how the money moves through these institutional pipelines to generate very specific policy outcomes. Let's try to map out that flow from the donor to policy generation to, public implementation.
It's a pretty clear three-stage system. It starts with the actors. These are the immensely wealthy donors, the Kochs, Olin, Scaife, Devos, and others. The money flows from their private or family foundations and into the second stage, the policy generation mechanisms.
These are the think tanks.
Right. Think tanks like Heritage, Cato, the American Enterprise Institute, or AEI. These centers are the ones that churn out the research papers, the model legislation, the legally vetted talking points. They create the foundational script.
Okay, then that policy output, that script, has to be converted into political action and amplified to the public. That's the third mechanism, right? The advocacy and marketing.
Precisely. This is often what people call astroturf advocacy. It's designed to look like spontaneous grassroots activism, but it's all secretly funded from the top down. So money flows to advocacy groups like Americans for Prosperity or AFP and FreedomWorks.
And they don't just put up ads.
Oh, no.
No.
It's much more sophisticated. They employ professional political operatives, guys like Tim Phillips and Jim Ellis, and high-level pollsters like Frank Luntz. Their job is to market these policies to the public using sophisticated, highly visible campaigns that completely conceal their financial backing.
And what's the most dramatic, maybe the most quantified example of this system working to produce a desired regulatory outcome for the network?
Mayer details the extensive campaign against climate science and environmental regulation. It's really staggering. A Drexel professor named Robert Bruhl found that a monumental sum, specifically $558 million between 2003 and 2010 alone, was channeled by 140 conservative foundations.
For what purpose?
Into a massive campaign to manipulate and mislead the public about the threat posed by climate change.
$500 million just dedicated to shaping public perception on a single scientific issue.
It just highlights the dedication to that core mission of regulatory self-preservation. So the network generates these counter-arguments. Sometimes they're highly specific, like the claim that CO2 is beneficial, which was pushed by groups with names like, I'm not kidding, plants need CO2.
Yeah.
This generated counter-narrative then needs an outlet.
Which leads us to the final component of that stage, the creation of a national echo chamber.
Yes. Advocacy groups like Americans for Prosperity made sure that their officers and their ideological allies became frequent guests on conservative talk radio, which is a medium with massive reach. Mayer also documents how the network secured paid deals with powerful conservative media personalities, including Glenn Beck and Mark Levin.
So they were buying the messengers.
They were ensuring that the unified anti-regulatory message was broadcast nationally, constantly, creating this pervasive political and media environment that successfully undermined public faith in environmental science and, forestalled costly federal regulation for years.
This brings us back sharply to that core incentive you mentioned, regulatory self-preservation. Mayer details the Koch industry's corporate conduct under Charles Koch's leadership, which she reports resulted in a stunning record of corporate malfeasance. This wasn't just abstract ideology, it was a reaction to very real fines and legal action.
The financial stakes were just enormous. Mayer cites numerous examples of environmental crimes that led to huge penalties. For instance, Koch Industries paid a then-record $30 million fine for thousands of violations of the Clean Water Act. This included the illegal discharge of millions of gallons of oil and ammonia into waterways. This wasn't just, an accident. It was systemic.
And the cost-benefit analysis of compliance versus violation seems to be the key factor driving all of this political spending.
It is. I think the most striking example Mayer details is the benzene emissions case in Corpus Christi, Texas. A technician exposed the company for covering up the discharge of 91 metric tons of benzene, which is the known human carcinogen. During the legal battle, the financial motivation became crystal clear. Complying with the safety emission standards would have cost the company around $7 million.
Okay.
However, that refinery earned $176 million in profits in 1995 alone. The potential fine and the cost of all this political spending were just dwarfed by the profits they derived from deliberately avoiding regulatory compliance.
So it was just a cost of doing business.
It demonstrated, in cold financial terms, the overwhelming incentive for massive political spending aimed at regulatory rollback.
And this commitment to profit over regulation even created these deeply uncomfortable public-private conflicts, like what she calls the formaldehyde conflict.
That case is highly problematic because it pits David Koch's public philanthropic identity directly against his company's corporate interest. David Koch was a celebrated benefactor of cancer research. He served on the advisory board of the prestigious National Cancer Institute.
Right, a very public-facing role.
A very public, very positive role. Yet, at the exact same time, his company, Georgia Pacific, was actively fighting federal efforts to classify formaldehyde, a major company product, as a known human carcinogen. They protested the NIH's findings, arguing against the scientific consensus. An NIH official cited in the book was quoted as calling it disgusting. For Koch to be advising the NCI given the clear vested financial interest in weakening cancer classifications for his own company's products.
So while the network was fighting all these regulatory battles, it was simultaneously building a specialized election machine to ensure long-term structural control. This leads us to the ambitious Red AMAP strategy.
Red AMAP was really the culmination of the electoral strategy. The Koch network didn't just rely on general political spending. They built their own high-tech data operation, a company called I360, merging it with other entities to create a highly sophisticated proprietary voter data bank. This technology allowed them to run elections strategically, surgically.
So what specifically was the Red AMAP strategy, and how was it funded through that dark money architecture we've been talking about?
RDFAP stood for Redistricting Majority Project. It was a really ambitious plan, backed by Republican strategists, and funded heavily by dark money channeled through groups like the Center to Protect Patient Rights, or CPPR. That group, run by a man named Sean Noble, accumulated nearly $62 million by the end of 2010 alone. And the plan was not to win the presidency or the Senate in 2010. It was much narrower. It focused on winning state governorships and, more importantly, state legislative chambers.
Why the intense focus on state chambers in a midterm year?
Because 2010 was the last election cycle before the 2012 decennial census, which triggers redistricting. By taking control of enough state houses, particularly in key swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, they would gain control over drawing the congressional district maps, gerrymandering, for the next decade.
So this was a long-term play for guaranteed structural power.
A very long-term play. And the payoff of that surgical investment, it was hugely successful. The massive influx of conservative, concealed donor money helped transform what was already a likely Republican wave into a systemic rout. They gained 63 seats in the House and secured control of those critical state houses.
And what did they do with that power?
Mayer details how those newly controlled state governments immediately began systematically enacting the precise policy agenda that was incubated by the network's think tanks. Gutting teacher pay, passing radical tax cuts that disproportionately benefited the wealthy, and enacting powerful anti-union laws. This strategy, Mayer concludes, became the gift that keeps on giving for the Republican Party. It cemented political dominance in those states regardless of the popular vote for years to come.
Okay, so if we connect this very detailed map of mechanisms from the 501c4 to the law and economics movement to a red map, what does this all mean? What does it mean for the concept of political equality and, the functioning of a representative democracy? What are the profound structural consequences that Mayer illuminates?
Well, it raises some really fundamental questions about the nature of political discourse and public trust. The system required sophisticated psychological manipulation. The network hired what they called policy entrepreneurs, like Frank Luntz. He didn't write policy, but he specialized in finding the right language to sell unpopular policies to the public. His job was to test phrases to translate policies that benefited the wealthy like gutting Medicare into language that was broadly appealing to the working class.
How did Luntz's testing directly impact policy framing in a real-world case?
Mayer details Luntz's work in the summer of 2009. He was targeting the Obama administration's healthcare reform. Luntz tested dozens of phrases, and he eventually advised the network that the most powerful, fear-inducing, and effective phrase to turn the public against the proposal was to label it a government takeover.
A phrase we all heard a million times.
A million times. And it was misleading. The plan involved mandatory private insurance purchases, but it was maximally effective at agitating voters who feared government intrusion.
And the consequence of using that tested, misleading language.
That framing successfully agitated fearful and angry voters. It fueled the AstroTurf Tea Party protests, which we now know were heavily backed by Koch money. Mayer notes that this tactic successfully obscures the true nature of proposed policies. It allows donors to sell ideas that voters would likely reject if they actually understood the financial self-interest behind them.
And the long-term structural consequence of that is
An ongoing erosion of public trust. Mayer notes that as the network consistently pushed this single unified message that government was America's biggest problem, public trust in government continually sank. It eventually dropped below trust in business by the early 1980s.
This concentration of power after Citizens United then gave a handful of individuals, the 1% of the 1%, as she calls them, just immense leverage.
That's right. The system effectively installed this small group of ultra-wealthy individuals as the country's political gatekeepers. And Mayer details how these individuals often had extreme or highly specific self-serving agendas. She cites Paul Singer, who is described as a vulture capitalist because of his investment style. His priority was pouring millions into opposing financial regulatory reform that might affect his industry.
And this immense, easily mobilized outside money fundamentally shifts the accountability of elected officials, doesn't it? How did Mayer document the resulting behavior in Congress?
The dark money groups, AFP, FreedomWorks, they acquired this crucial strategic leverage over Republican office holders. They gained the power to threaten primary challenges against any moderate Republican who strayed even slightly from the hardline free market orthodoxy that was mandated by the donors.
And she has specific examples of this.
She does. She details the case of Representative Fred Upton, who reversed his long-held moderate stance on climate change after the network launched a sustained attack against him.
And the cost for not complying, for not falling in line.
Mayer notes the experience of Representative Bob Inglis. He lost his seat after making the seemingly harmless move of acknowledging that global warming was real and suggesting some modest policy changes. The Koch network targeted him. They funded his opponent. This mechanism ensures that the political obstruction, which benefits the donor's anti-regulatory goals, is enforced by the constant threat of these expensive, career-ending primary challenges.
So the elected official becomes accountable to the outside money structure, not to the traditional electorate.
Their incentives are completely rewired.
And it also appears that the network began paying for what seemed like core governmental functions, blurring the line between private political financing and the legislative process itself.
This is one of the most striking findings regarding the cost of governance. Mayer details the ethically dubious overlap surrounding Paul Ryan's radical 2011 budget proposal, which included massive tax cuts and entitlement reform. The Koch network's money was used to pay for expensive private polling and market testing, paid for by a Koch-backed group called Public Notice, to help Ryan refine his pitch and popularize the budget.
So let me get this straight. A private ideological group was determining the public relations strategy for the federal budget.
Precisely. The research was paid for by donor money, and the explicit goal, according to an operative, was to help the GOP minimize political damage from cuts to entitlement spending. They advised Ryan and his allies to avoid the word cut and instead use softer language like efficiencies or getting your money's worth.
So this demonstrates how private financing doesn't just shape the ideas before they get to Congress.
It actively pays to package, market, and implement core legislative proposals to the American public. The system is designed to provide seamless end-to-end support for the donor's agenda.
This deep dive really forces us to situate these mechanisms within the broader context of American history. Mayer argues this isn't just modern corruption, it's the culmination of a long struggle against campaign finance reform, which was designed to enforce political equality.
That's exactly right. The book frames the Koch network's activities as a deliberate return to the Gilded Age, the era of robber barons like Rockefeller and Vanderbilt. Campaign finance laws, like the Tillman Act of 1907 banning corporate contributions, were specifically put in place during the Progressive era to curb corruption stemming from this concentrated wealth.
So Citizens United was a rollback of that.
The Citizens United decision, which the Koch network fought so hard to achieve through their academic and legal infrastructure, represented the successful gutting of a century of those reforms. It opened the floodgates for unlimited, untraceable private spending.
And the concentration of wealth underwriting this political transformation is just hard to overstate.
The sheer financial power concentrated at those Koch donor summits was, in her word, extraordinary. Mayer notes that at just one meeting in 2010, the combined assets of only 11 attendees on the Forbes 400 list amounted to $129.1 billion. This handful of people had the unified resources and the singular focus to fund what they referred to internally as the mother of all wars against the Obama administration and, more broadly, against regulatory government itself.
This commitment to political militancy often contrasts so starkly with the donor's public, very carefully curated image. David Koch, for example, was celebrated in New York City as a generous patron of the arts and medicine.
And this contrast between private political action and public philanthropy is critical to how the system maintains its longevity. David Koch donated millions to institutions like Lincoln Center, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and cancer research centers. This high-profile philanthropy confers this aura of generosity, of public spiritedness and respectability. And it often masks the ruthless political operation working in secret to roll back the very environmental and public safety regulations that protect the public.
So the visibility of the charity serves as a powerful shield against class resentment and political scrutiny.
It does.
And speaking of scrutiny, when Mayer first shone a light on this political activity with her 2010 New Yorker article, she notes that visibility bred an immediate and very intense response.
The network's reaction really illustrates the ruthless intensity of their defense of secrecy. Mayer details the aggressive opposition research effort that was launched against her professional credibility. Conservative outlets, including the Daily Caller, tried to smear her with allegations of plagiarism regarding her earlier work. The reporting was ultimately shoddy and unsubstantiated, but the episode demonstrates the lengths the network will go to defend its political operations and, specifically, its anonymity against public exposure. They treat investigative journalism itself as a political enemy.
Finally, let's return to that strategic manipulation of perception, because even with all the funding in the world, the network knew internally that their policy agenda was fundamentally unpopular with moderate voters.
This insight is amazing. It comes from the leaked audio of Richard Fink, who was a key Koch political lieutenant. He's speaking frankly at a 2014 donor summit. And Fink admitted that their agenda focused on decreasing regulations for profit and decreasing taxes was unpopular, and that the crucial middle third of moderate voters viewed them as greedy.
And he was brutally honest about it.
He was. He conceded, and this is quote, "We want to decrease regulations. Why? It's because we can make more profit. Cuff it. Yeah? Yeah, and cut government spending so we don't have to pay so much taxes." There's truth in that.
So if the policies were viewed as greedy, the solution wasn't to change the policies. It was to fundamentally change the narrative around the intent.
Exactly. The strategic solution was to launch this massive rebranding effort, changing their intent framing. Fink stated they needed to launch a movement for well-being, dedicated to convincing the public that unfettered free market capitalism was the only true path to human well-being. This, despite the immediate optics of extreme wealth concentration and corporate self-interest.
And Charles Koch himself later adopted this framing.
He did.
Yeah.
He started saying the goal was for people to have the hope that they can advance on their own merits, which completely ignores the obvious role of inherited concentrated wealth in the lives of the major donors. It just proves that power in the system is maintained through both vast amounts of money and the systematic manipulation of perception and narrative.
So Jane Mayer's Dark Money reveals a comprehensive blueprint for how a small number of extraordinarily wealthy individuals successfully implemented a long-term, multi-pronged strategy. This architecture encompassing ideology, law, academia, grassroots advocacy, and electoral politics was designed and executed to achieve policy goals aligned with radical free market principles and, unequivocally, their own financial interests. And the structural implication for you, the listener, is critical here. The goal was never just to win an election cycle. It was, as Charles Koch himself articulated, systematic. Our goal is to roll back government. This systematic, decades-long weakening of governmental function and regulatory capacity helps explain why political outcomes so often seem disconnected from majority public opinion and instead reflect the sustained, highly concentrated efforts of a secretive economic infrastructure.
As Mayer's reporting indicates that by 2016, the Kochs had their sights set on influencing all three branches of government, the final question for you, the listener, is whether the concept of democratic political equality, where one person gets one vote, can functionally survive when a powerful, highly sophisticated, and largely secret economic infrastructure is dedicated to supplanting one of the country's major political parties and fundamentally reshaping the role of government itself. We want to credit Jane Mayer for her meticulous reporting in Dark Money, the hidden history of the billionaires behind the rise of the radical right. We highly encourage you to read the book yourself, support investigative journalism, or check your local library. For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description. If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.